you.
Sure, I just woke up, so I haven't put on a tie yet.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening and good morning to our distinguished guests. It's a great pleasure and honor to have today another good discussion in the series of discussions on the NATO enlargement and international security and foreign policy issues organized by the Rondelli Foundation. Today we have a very, very special panel with distinguished guests they don't need the introduction, but very briefly, let me introduce to them, represent President Toomas Hendrik Ilves is with us today. He served as fourth president of Estonia from 2006 to 2016. Previously, he has been twice the Minister of Foreign Affairs of with the Estonian government and been as member of the European Parliament. I cannot miss this opportunity to thank again President Ilves for his unwavering support for Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity in the hardest times of my country. And thank you once again, President, and great to have you with us today. We also have Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, a career diplomat and the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO. He also served as ambassador to South Korea and to Russian Federation as well as to NATO. And his experience is very, very important and very helpful and useful for today's discussion. And of course, last but not least, definitely Ambassador Professor Michael McFaul, the former ambassador of United States to Russian Federation and assistant to President Obama and the architect of the Russia restart strategy, and of course very, very high professional in now recently he is with the Stanford University, the Professor Angela Nomelini, Professor in International Studies in the Department of Political Science, and he is the Director of the Freeman's Policy Institute for International Studies. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time in this very, very important moment in the week before the NATO Summit. In a few days left until the G7 leaders meeting in United Kingdom, and of course the bilateral summit between the US President Joseph Biden and the Russian leader Vladimir Putin. I would very much like to ask you to elaborate on what kind of NATO we will get after the NATO summit. As far as I know, it will be a very short summit. What will be the outcome, the results, what would be the result of this summit, and what kind of NATO we will get. More in a wider picture, I know that there will be discussions, a lot of discussions on China, on cooperation between the United States and Europe to deter China, and how to deal with China. How united is United States and Europe in dealing with China. And of course, Russia, threat coming from Russia. We, Georgians and Ukrainians, are feeling the threat on a daily basis, amassing the troops along the border with the Ukraine, more than 100,000 Russian troops, and there are the news that these troops are still there, this threat represented to Georgia and Ukraine is very real. So I would like to ask you what, how, and when could join Georgia and Ukraine the North Atlantic Organization, Alliance. This is an issue which is of the highest interest in Georgian society. So I will shut up here for technical details. You can start with the 7-8 minute opening remarks, and then we will dwell on further with the questions. For the questions, can put the here is the Q&A mechanism here, or you can raise the hand and put your question. So, President Ilves, the floor is yours. Please, we're ready.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be back here, Dr. Petriashvili, and at least virtually, if not in reality. Well, I think that the last sort of couple of weeks before, in the run-up to the summit, there have been some disappointments that at least have people on the eastern side, eastern part of NATO, a little concerned. I mean, one was the decision to allow Nord Stream to go ahead, or at least that the Biden administration will not be pushing that. And then the additional decision not to meet with President Zelensky before the NATO summit, which it wasn't a great signal, but if you take into account also the implicit threats in Vladimir Putin's Petersburg statement on Ukraine, it doesn't, I mean, it does get people a little anxious and worried. Clearly, Nord Stream will not, I mean, the prospect of Nord Stream somehow being sanctioned or getting in the way of discussions disappeared with President Biden's announcement, I guess 2 weeks ago. And certainly we would have hoped that at least meeting with President Zelensky beforehand would have at least sent a signal of support to Ukraine that I think they very much need. In terms of expectations of the summit, I think, I mean, my gut feeling says that on sort of more basic technical issues, the United States will be forthcoming, more and better exercises. Of course, the 2% issue remains on the table for as long as majority of European allies aren't up there. I should note again that it's actually the Easterners who largely fulfilled that requirement, and the laggards tend to be more in the western part of NATO. I would hope that there is a far stronger emphasis than previously on cyber defense, cyber issues. It was at the Warsaw Summit that NATO declared cyber a fourth domain of warfare for NATO. Of course, in the US, it's already a fifth domain after space. Given the rash of cyber attacks that we have seen in the last 2 weeks, I guess it should be in the United States. I would hope it's especially salient, but nonetheless, if we go back since the last summit, the activities, cyber activities, and here I actually include not only hacking and doxing, but also the use of disinformation on the part of the Russians, has increased dramatically, and we see it right now, especially in the past year regarding COVID, where the Russians are spreading anti-vaxxer propaganda on the one hand. On the other hand, they've also been in order to support their own Sputnik vaccine, they have also been putting out basically lies on the lack of efficacy or effectiveness of the vaccines that have been approved by the EU Medicines Agency, that is AstraZeneca and Moderna and Pfizer. And certainly that has also had an effect. I mean, the two of them, denigrating the extent and acceptable vaccinations as well as promoting anti-vaxxer material has had an effect on people's health. And then, of course, I think what will be hard to avoid will be the issue of Belarus, a country that is that unlike Ukraine and Georgia really has no NATO aspirations whatsoever, but certainly the idea of an inter-European flight to be hijacked in flight, that is a flight from one European capital to another, where the company is European, the plane is registered in Europe, and all but a handful of passengers are EU citizens, has caused a good deal of consternation. But not enough consternation, unfortunately, within the European Union to take up serious measures, of course, aside from banning flights. On the other hand, my understanding, and I hope that this is investigated further, but when it came to drawing up sanctions, every country almost pulled out or took out of the individuals to be sanctioned people who were of economic importance to that country. And so we ended up, the lowest common denominator is truly a lowest common denominator here. But that will certainly be an issue in the NATO summit. And of course, there will be the summit with the EU, short also. And I suspect that will be kind of feel-goody rather than substantive. And finally, well, there will be the so-called summit. I wouldn't call it a summit because that's certainly giving too much to Vladimir Putin, but there is the meeting in Geneva with Putin. I don't know. The latest statement I saw from Secretary of State Blinken just an hour or two ago was that in response to the question, why are you having a meeting with Putin if he's doing these cyber attacks, meaning the colonial oil and also the attack on meat suppliers? And the answer was, well, that's precisely why we're having the meeting. But I don't know if I was Zelensky, I'd say, oh, if I want to have a meeting with Biden, I should do cyber attacks on the United States, which of course will not happen. But in any case, the messaging is kind of, could be a little better. In any case, that's, I think, where it stands. And certainly I'm eager to hear what Sandy and Mike have to say on this.
Thank you. Sandy, there are very few who knows better than you what was going to happen at the NATO Summit on June 14th. There will be a discussion on NATO 2030, the adaptation, the conceptual document. What is this document about, and what this summit is going to be about? Just the demonstration of the unity of United States and allies? Is this the only outcome what we're going to see and have after the summit?
Well, first of all, thank you, Alex, for the invitation, and thanks to the Rondelli Foundation for the chance to participate in this discussion. I think the one sentence answer to your question is both. It's about reaffirming the transatlantic relationship, but also setting the agenda for the next decade and beyond in the face of new challenges. I think the whole trip, of course, has that purpose as well. But I, as a NATO junkie, would describe the NATO summit as the centerpiece of this trip, and it will, of course, be a demonstration of his promise to restore and revitalize U.S. alliances after 4 years of America First policies and rhetoric. Fortunately for NATO, Trump's bark was worse than his bite, at least in terms of the capabilities of the alliance itself. But his bashing of allied leaders, his kowtowing toward Putin, all combined to generate fears that the U.S. was abandoning its commitment to European security, and had Trump been reelected, might even pull out of NATO itself. So this summit will certainly be another opportunity for Biden to stress that America is back, and that the U.S. is working to unite the world's democracies in confronting the world's leading autocracies, Russia and China, and the threats that they pose to the rules-based international order. And I think Biden himself said in his op-ed in the Washington Post yesterday that forging this kind of united front is the prerequisite for the last stop on the trip, the encounter with Vladimir Putin on the 14th. I agree with Tom Ilves, by the way, that it would have been good to squeeze in a stop in Kiev on the way to Geneva to further cement that united front, but we can come back to that later. But still, the main goal of the summit is political, to reaffirm the transatlantic bond, the shared values that it's based upon, and to recommit allies to working together to meet all these different challenges. But behind the feel-good rhetoric, Biden is also going to be trying to allay the lingering doubts that Europeans have that the forces that led to the election of Donald Trump and that demonstrated strong support for American retrenchment from alliances like NATO are gone for good, and try to allay their worries that the America First policies will be back in 2 or 4 years after this brief interlude with the Biden administration. Now, the summit's not going to produce any major new decisions, but it will, as I said, set the agenda for the next stage in NATO's continuing process of adaptation. And it's all under this banner of NATO 2030. And I think in short, it's defining what NATO has to do to prepare itself in full for an era of long-term great power competition, while at the same time addressing all the different global challenges and challenges from within. We've seen in recent years NATO fault lines exposed, whether it's backsliding on democracy in Hungary and Turkey, or freelancing in the Middle East also by Turkey. There are challenges to alliance cohesion from within as well as from external actors. The main deliverable is going to be a tasking by the heads of state and government to update NATO's strategic concept by the time of next year's NATO summit. I've had the dubious honor of working on all the strategic concepts back to 1991. This one is quite important because the 2010 version, the most recent one, treated Russia as a partner, not as an aggressive revisionist adversary, and didn't mention China at all. So the strategic concept, I think, will be the vehicle for trying to pull together a more coherent NATO strategy towards China, which is still very much work in progress, with a lot of differences on whether NATO even should be the place to talk about strategy towards China. And I think there's also work that needs to be done on NATO strategy towards Russia, where we've done a great job on deterrence and defense and protection of NATO's own territory, but we've done far less well in countering Russian political warfare, disinformation, cyber attacks, subversion, and in strengthening the security of the countries in between, especially Ukraine and Georgia. NATO talks regularly about having this two-track approach to Russia, which is a nice template, but doesn't have much content right now in terms of changing Russian behavior. And so I don't expect any breakthroughs at this summit, but I hope that the strategic concept will be the vehicle for a more robust, more dynamic Russia policy. Alongside the strategic concept review, there'll be some markers laid down on areas where NATO has to strengthen its capabilities and its role. One of these is of course its defense and deterrence posture, where a lot has been done, but there's new challenges posed by emerging disruptive technologies, artificial intelligence, and different transnational threats. In this regard, there'll be a big push to strengthen resilience, both resilience in the physical sense, but also the resilience of our democratic institutions, which is a bit of a harder challenge for the alliance. There'll be the launch of an innovation initiative designed to help allies maintain NATO's technological edge by trying to come up with a mechanism similar to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the Pentagon, to combine the capabilities and the R&D potential of allies to produce game-changing new technologies. There'll be an effort to strengthen NATO's role as a forum for transatlantic consultations. There'll be a call for updating and deepening NATO's partnerships, especially with the Asia-Pacific democracies, and bringing in new partners such as India into the group. There'll be a call for a stronger NATO role in addressing climate change, not to make NATO the vehicle for managing the broader challenge of getting to global zero, but at least strengthening NATO's role in addressing the security implications of climate change and coming up with ways to mitigate the impact of military forces and military operations on global warming. So there's a lot of topics that will at least be mentioned in the communique, but it's a short meeting, 5 minutes per world leader to speak. So as is often the case, a lot of the heavy lifting goes into drafting of the communique. But in this case, I think it will be an important signal of where NATO intends to go. Now, before I finish, I think there's one area where, unfortunately, there won't be much in the way of strong signaling, and that is on NATO's open door policy and the prospects for Georgian and Ukrainian membership. And I lament this because 13 years have now passed since the Bucharest Summit, when NATO pledged that Georgia and Ukraine will be members someday. And with the alliance defining its future out to the year 2030, one would think NATO would be ready to at least consider some next steps to move forward on enlargement. But I regret that Russia's continued aggression in Donbass, including the recent buildup on the Ukrainian borders and in the Black Sea, and its continued low-level military pressure through the occupation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, have only reinforced Allied caution and the Allied fears of encouraging some new Russian offensive actions by even modest steps forward on the open door. So I think the most Ukraine and Georgia can look forward to is communique language that will reaffirm the Bucharest Pledge and urgings to continue domestic and defense reforms, which is all well and good. But I think the overall message will be one of marking time on enlargement. And I fear that this will only confirm in Putin's mind that continuing to occupy parts of Ukraine and Georgia gives Russia a permanent veto on these countries' Euro-Atlantic aspirations. And it will certainly disincentivize Moscow from agreeing to any political solutions in the Donbass or in the Caucasus. I don't have any ready answer to the question of what is to be done in this situation. Clearly, NATO isn't ready to move forward, and Ukraine and Georgia do have more homework to do in terms of preparing themselves for membership. But I think there's more allies can do to strengthen Ukraine's and Georgia's defense capabilities, to better deter new Russian aggression. Both are still very vulnerable, even with the military assistance that the US provided. I think other allies should get into the game of supporting Ukraine and Georgia militarily. This shouldn't just be a US effort. And finally, and perhaps most controversially, Ukraine and Georgia should work on the Biden administration over the next year or two to urge the new administration to take the initiative on this issue rather than be part of a lowest common denominator consensus in the alliance. And that would mean NATO doing its homework on how to prepare the ground for actual admission of Georgia and Ukraine, even as the frozen conflicts remain unresolved. This means an integration plan that would determine how we're going to extend an Article 5 guarantee to countries which have pieces of their territory still under occupation. It would mean coming up also with ways to manage the Russian reaction, the way we did back in the 90s with the NATO-Russia Founding Act, assurances regarding the presence of nuclear weapons and the like. Different solutions may be needed, but I think we need a Russia strategy to make the world safe for Georgia and Ukraine to become members of NATO sometime before 2030, but hopefully well before 2030. But even without a NATO integration plan for these two countries, there's a lot that allies can do to support Ukraine and Georgia in every domain, including the military domain. And I hope allies will recognize the need to do that as part of the review of the strategic concept and NATO 2030. But as I said, don't expect any exciting new signals coming out of this particular meeting when it comes to the open door. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think it wasn't really very good signal not inviting. I understand that it was a short, it is a short summit with 5 minutes for each leader, but not inviting the partners, and especially Georgia and Ukraine, will be a signal for the people in Moscow. They already have reflected on that, so the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has already mentioned that Georgia and Ukraine are like students sent to do the homework, and the only parents are gathering in Brussels. And so the message was very well taken, if we can say so. So this is the first trip of the President Biden abroad, and he starts in UK with the G7 leaders, and then, as we said, in Brussels with the allies, and the ending will be with a meeting with Vladimir Putin. I saw, Ambassador McFaul, your opinion paper in Washington Post. You have laid out perfectly what should be the how should we evaluate the meeting of President Biden with Vladimir Putin. And I just want to follow on what President Ilves said. Why is that meeting happening? And there is no high expectation from that meeting. You also expressed that no, there will be no breaking through results with this meeting, and Russia is not expecting. Why is that meeting happening, and what should we expect at that meeting and after the meeting with Vladimir Putin?
Well, thanks, Alex, for having me. A great panel, a great group. I look forward to meeting in physical conditions someday soon in your country. I mean, my guess, I don't know why exactly. I want to be clear. I don't work for the Biden administration, although I know them rather well. But I think their theory of this meeting is they want to freeze, where there's been talk about frozen conflicts. They want to freeze the conflict with Russia. They want to just park it in some place. They want to use this meeting as an incentive to Mr. Putin to not do more crazy revisionist, aggressive behavior in the world, including against my country, but against the countries in the region. And they want to do that in order to focus on China. Obviously, the rise of China is the central moment of international relations for the next, I think, for the 21st century. The Biden team realizes that as well. They are putting a lot of time and attention to rethinking their strategy towards China. They've built a very big team at the National Security Council under Kurt Campbell. He's the first deputy assistant to the president to be in charge of that region. That's a structural change that we've never had at the NSC. That's where I used to work, actually. Ambassador Vershbow worked there too. And the Russia piece is just, please don't bother us. We don't want to hear from you for the next 4 years. I think I'm making it more black and white. I'm making it more simplistic than their real strategy. But I think that was part of it, right? So they sanctioned, rightfully so, the behavior, the cyber attacks on SolarWinds and the interference in our 2020 election, as they promised to do. But remember, you'll notice that the president said we responded proportionately, as if now that's done, that's part of the past. And right as they did that, they said, let's meet in Geneva. And I think that's their strategy. I also think it will fail. I want to be very blunt. I don't think it will work. And I want to be clear about this. I agree with meeting with Mr. Putin and President Xi and all kinds of, meetings with your adversaries as a general rule for diplomacy is a good idea, if nothing more than to reduce uncertainty and avoid conflict based on bad information or miscalculation. So I support it in general, but the idea that this will create the incentives for Mr. Putin to not do anything provocative, I think is incorrect. I think he will continue to provoke. He will continue. I think he's way more revisionist, by the way, and a threat to the liberal international order than China is today. He has less power, of course, but he is more committed. He has more will to do things that I think undermine the international system. Annexation, for instance, is something that the Chinese have not done. He supports dictators. He intervened in Syria to support one of the most horrible dictators in the world. He attacked our sovereignty in 2016 and then did it again in 2020. And I don't think a meeting in Geneva is going to stop him from that very, what I consider, aggressive revisionist agenda. Now, I actually also think that President Biden and his team do understand that as well. Remember, President Biden is a quite experienced a foreign policy official. He knows Europe and most certainly Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova better than any president we've ever had. I think there's no question to that. I've actually been with the vice president to Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, now that I think about it, and Russia, when I served in the Obama administration. So I think they understand the limitations of this strategy, but they want to try it and then I think they should be prepared for failure. But Alex, you asked, I think, a very important question. What happens after Geneva? This is an attempt at engagement. I hope they can launch strategic stability talks. I know that's their ambition, and that is very important because the New START treaty, which Putin and Biden rightly extended for 5 years, that's going to run out a lot faster than people think. And a follow-on to that, I think, is necessary. And just like in the Cold War, when you have nothing else that you can talk about, this is an important thing. But I don't think that's a sufficient Russia policy. It's a component of it, but it can't be the end of it. And I really think, to your point, what they do after they get back to Geneva is more important than whatever they may accomplish in engaging with Putin in Geneva. And let me just mention 3 things quickly in terms of what I think needs to be the agenda. One has already been said by Ambassador Vershbow and President Ilves, which is on the NATO piece. The most important, I actually agree with Sandy, the most important moment of this trip is most certainly not Geneva, and I don't even think it's London. It is the NATO Summit. They're having a hard time communicating that, by the way, to our Western press. I can tell you, as a member of their Western press these days, I work for NBC News. All of the focus is on Geneva. I'll be flying to Geneva at the end of the week. I'm not flying to London or Brussels, just so you know, and most of their top personalities, TV personalities, will not be there either. They'll be in Geneva. But I think they need to focus attention on the NATO Summit and on resilience, as my colleagues have said, And you know, we could go into details maybe in questions, but I think it is a big mistake to put too much focus on China. Yes, we need a new strategic concept. And yes, the 2010 document seems like ancient history. I was just looking at it the other night, especially because it doesn't mention China and the language it has about Russia. But I think when that's rewritten, you know, NATO is about defending allies against attack. Russia is the central threat to NATO allies. China is not. And I fear that we're so obsessed now in Washington with our grand strategy to contain China and engage China and compete China. They actually don't use the word contain. That's my word, not theirs. They use the word compete. I think that's right. I think it's absolutely correct. We could spend a whole hour talking about it. But to put everything through that prism, I think is incorrect, because I think it is a major challenge for many years to come to contain Putin's Russia. And NATO should focus on that central strategic objective. Number two, I just want to echo what Sandy said. We need a real strategy for how we strengthen democracies and market economies and defense capabilities of countries stuck between NATO and Russia. First and foremost on my list is, of course, Georgia and Ukraine. But I would add others. You know, I would add Moldova to the list, and it is not sufficient to just hope that there will be no dramas there. I think that's the wrong strategy. That's a defensive strategy. That's hoping that you don't have to respond to some new Putin belligerent behavior. I want to see President Biden and his team think comprehensively about an offensive strategy for strengthening democracy and markets, particularly in Georgia and Ukraine. Both countries face real challenges, and both countries are not getting enough attention, in my view, from Washington. And Biden, of all presidents, who has spent more time in your country and Ukraine than President Biden? And same with Secretary Blinken. These are people that know this region well, and I want to encourage them to think big and not just think about crisis avoidance. And I could, you know, I have several ideas, you know, special envoys, big reform packages, high-level task forces to engage with Georgia and Ukraine about reform. We could talk about the details, but I think it would be just conceptually, they need something big and new with respect to the countries stuck between. And then third and finally, you know, anybody who knows my thinkings on these issues will not be surprised that I really appreciate what President Biden has said about the need for democracies to unite and the importance of the ideological struggle between autocracies and democracies. I think analytically, he's right about that. I want him to do two more things, however. One, I want him to, you know, on the diagnostic part, spend more time conveying to the world that this struggle is not just between democratic states and autocratic states. It's within democracies between autocrats and Democrats, including, by the way, in my own country, but also in most of Europe. And so when we say we want to unite democracies, I don't want them just to be, no disrespect, President Ilves, I don't want them to be just bringing presidents and prime ministers together at democratic summits. I want it to be a summit of small d Democrats, where we understand that this is not just state to state, but within societies. And then on the prescriptive part, again, we need we're just playing way too much defense. We're just always doing anti-corruption, anti-cyber, anti-this, anti-that. We need an affirmative, positive agenda for ideas about democracy. I think that's with respect to media, for instance. I think it's with respect to the way we try to support democratic actors around the world. And I hope that eventually that becomes part of a grand strategy for responding to Putin's Russia.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. We have a first question here. Thank you very much for all four of you, all three of you, for your very important messages and inputs for our discussion. But here comes the question from my colleague, Ambassador Badridze. For several years, Russia has been employing a Cold War modus operandi against not just its near abroad, but against the US and EU. As much as most Western countries would like to avoid a new Cold War, do they see that Russia interprets gestures of goodwill as a weakness, which provokes it more than anything else? Will we see a new containment policy anytime soon? President, let me start with you. And the mic, please. Microphone, please.
Yeah, I also had my hand up up there for a short comment. Well, I mean, whatever I mean, people probably don't want to call anything a containment policy, but I would say that here I would expand on what Mike McFaul said. I mean, I think there are two things that need to be done. One is indeed expand very proactive, and I would even say not simply American, but actually sort of, if nothing else, a coalition of the willing to really work on these major issues that need to shore up democracy in the, as the Germans would call it, the Zwischenländer, the countries in between. But I think what we also need is some kind of perhaps not so explicit game plan for when the Russians do something, because what we've seen since 2008, we saw it repeated in 2014, we saw it repeated most recently with the sort of, I don't know, real or pseudo crisis around Ukraine and the troop buildups, is that whenever we see bad behavior, the response is, yes, but they're not NATO members, so we can't do anything. I mean, and that is the wrong message, because it just says to the Russians, oh, we can do this because NATO can't do anything, and therefore we're not going to do anything. Add to that, I mean, basically, I think one of the more disappointing things of the last 2 weeks, which I alluded to, is this combination of, first of all, saying there are no sanctions on Nord Stream 2. And then when Mrs. Baerbock, the sort of the chancellor candidate for the upcoming German elections, suggests, in fact, selling arms to Georgia, the government comes out and says, no, we cannot sell arms to a conflict zone in which the conflict is not created by Ukraine. It's created precisely by the country with which you have completed Nord Stream 2. I mean, you look at this and it's kind of like the Germans just pocketed a double victory. They can do whatever they want when it comes to the country that's the primary victim of Nord Stream 2, and get away with it, and at the same time play this, I would say, rather disingenuous moral authority of, no, we don't sell arms to those people, while you're making deals with the people that are causing the whole war. And I really hope the United States, with other countries who I'm sure are willing to say something, will do something to Germany and say, look, this is not acceptable behavior. You can't have it both ways. There.
Thank you. You mentioned the candidate for the Green Party, Ms. Baerbock, who could change the foreign policy of Germany towards the Euro-Atlantic integration. Should we expect that if she is elected and she wins the elections and is the next chancellor of Germany, is there a chance that Nord Stream 2 will still face the problems with the certification and with the finalization and launching on it?
I don't
Do you
know. I mean, I don't think we should speculate at this point on the outcome of the German election. I mean, the CDU just did rather well, better than expected in Saxony. So I think we should avoid that. I mean, I think the best we can hope for is actually that the Greens will be in a coalition, and if not in the chancellor driving position, then most obviously then as Minister of Foreign Affairs. And it is, I mean, what is missed, by the way, in the United States is that, I mean, the Greens have been, since Joschka Fischer, and including him, the most transatlanticist party in Germany. I mean, debunking all of the kind of myths about the Greens being sort of, leftist, peacenik, tree huggers. They are not. They've been absolutely the best on human rights violations and freedom issues in Ukraine and in Russia, for that matter. But it's too early to speculate, I think.
Would you like to elaborate on the question which I put, Sandy?
Okay, just briefly, I know we have limited time, but first of all, I agree with Mike McFaul's point that this effort to de-escalate and encourage Putin to behave himself, not necessarily to solve the problems, it isn't going to work. I think it's clear that Putin needs a sense of confrontation with the West. This whole encircled, besieged fortress metaphor that you hear a lot in the Russian debate. He needs that to justify the continued repression at home and the continued effort to suppress democratic movements in the neighboring former Soviet republics. And I think that the other driving force for Putin is his genuine fear that the West's policy aims at regime change in Russia itself. So for all these reasons, he's not going to play ball when it comes to a more stable and predictable relationship, as much as we all would like a more stable and predictable relationship. And I do think that some of the tactics leading up to this meeting have been counterproductive. And so the question from Ambassador Badridze is absolutely on target. Signs of restraint, emphasizing proportionality, not that you want to be disproportionate, but to stress your proportionality only emboldens Putin to escalate further or to pocket any concessions that you make. So we do need, and this is where US leadership is still indispensable, is a much more dynamic approach to Russia, which, as I said earlier, I hope will be one of the products of the strategic concept review, but I'm not holding my breath, because I think this notion that the administration is trying to park the relationship with Russia, however futile that may be. There's a tendency also to park the relationship with Europe, to assume that Europe doesn't have enough clout. It's still underspending on its own defense and security. It tends to be conflict averse, as we've seen over the years, and not just in German policy, but in other countries. All these things taken together may be convincing the Biden administration to basically write off Europe, again, to concentrate its resources on containing China. I think this is a missed opportunity, because the Europeans actually know that there is a danger of a resurgence of anti-European, America first thinking, even as soon as the midterm elections, and that there's an opportunity to kind of push Europeans to take more responsibility, to do more to maintain security in their own neighborhood, to contribute, at least in some ways, to managing the China challenge, but especially doing more to strengthen deterrence against Russia and help the countries in between. So I would hope that Biden will come away with maybe a more hopeful view of what the Europeans can do than he may be going into this meeting with.
And I also like President Biden said that he will go in the meeting with Vladimir Putin, and he will talk to him from the position of strength. Will he dwell on the Navalny and the Protasevich issue and human rights issue? There have been repressions in Russia, ongoing repressions, arresting the opposition leaders. President Biden has raised in the telephone conversations, he will raise this issue with President Vladimir Putin as well. But what do you expect that would be the reaction from the Russian side? I mean, is there any chance to ease the situation with the human rights inside Russian Federation?
That's to me?
Yeah, to Mike.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Me first. Okay. Well, I hope that President Biden will raise those issues. He said he will. I don't expect any change whatsoever in Putin's policies as a result of it. But the absence of not saying them, the decision not to say them, to get to the point that my colleagues were discussing earlier, will be looked at as a sign of weakness from Mr. Putin. He expects Biden to raise those things, and if he doesn't, he will pocket that concession. He'll think, oh, maybe I, they want to treat me with respect. And remember, Putin's not rolling into this meeting with his list of talking points of how to improve relations with the United States. So why are we thinking in those terms? Why should our government think, well, let's figure out a way we can improve relations with Vladimir Putin? I just think that is conceptually wrong. I think it's conceptually wrong about all diplomacy, but most certainly with Vladimir Putin. The second point, though, I think is very important. What Ambassador Vershbow said is I hope President Biden understands how paranoid Putin has become. This year, I think, will go down in history as the most repressive year of the Putin era inside Russia. And that's happening for a reason, because he is paranoid, he's losing support. And to Sandy's point, therefore, he needs the West, he needs the United States as an enemy so that he can blame us for all their problems and blame us for why he needs to be repressive. I just think it's incumbent upon President Biden and the rest of the free world to speak more openly and aggressively about supporting democratic ideas. That does not mean sending checks to Alexei Navalny. Of course not. We don't do that, and that would be counterproductive. But I do think this idea of an affirmative agenda for democratic ideas, including, I think we need to fundamentally change, for instance, the way we manage our U.S. government-funded media organizations. President Ilves knows one of them well. And I think we should make them all independent. I think there's lots more we could do in that space. And I know, for instance, that's what, people, democratic thinkers inside countries like Russia and Belarus want to see from this administration. So far, they were elated. Remember Biden's reputation. Yeah, Alex, you know it as well as anybody. We all know President Biden's reputation for these sets of issues, right? And there was, in my worlds, people I know in Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, people were extremely excited that Trump was defeated and Biden won election. And I just think it's now incumbent upon the president to translate that goodwill into practical policies that is not just speeches, but actually implementing things that can help advance these democratic ideas, especially in your region of the world, but I would say more broadly as well.
Thank you. Sandy?
Yeah, a little to add to that. Absolutely, Biden has to raise these issues or Putin will assume that he's got a free pass, green light to do more of these things. Hopefully that will be coupled with credible threats of additional consequences and additional costs to Russia if it continues down this path. And that would be more convincing if we had greater allied unity and support, not just of sanctions, but of other steps that can undermine Putin's political strength at home, using declassified intelligence to expose the ill-gotten wealth of Putin and his most senior cronies would be one useful thing we could be doing. And getting serious about cleaning up our own economies and own banking systems when it comes to dark money as well. We have to practice what we preach. But I also think we have to make clear that we're not giving up on encouraging peaceful democratic change inside Russia. There's not a moral equivalence between how the Russians interfere in our elections and how we've historically, particularly since the end of the Cold War, supported democratization and civil society in the former Soviet bloc. We should be proud of what we accomplished with that and look for ways in the current more hostile conditions to keep that up, whether it's through exchanges, new ideas with regard to broadcasting, use of social media in a more creative way. Just because Putin thinks this is about regime change doesn't mean we should pull our punches or restrain ourselves. This is in our long-term interest, and it's in Russia's long-term interest to ultimately get back on the path that they were on in the 90s. And even in the first few years of Putin, when I was ambassador, there was still a battle for civil society in which it was legitimate for the US to speak out about that. We're not going back to that while Putin is still in power, but we still have to find ways to be true to our values and without putting people at risk, encourage the kind of grassroots democracy that I think Russia is still capable of. We shouldn't assume that Russia is genetically incapable of democracy.
Very last question, and not least, definitely, U.S.-Turkey relationship and Turkey itself as a player in our region. There will be a bilateral meeting between the President Biden and Mr. Erdogan. How should President Biden deal with Erdogan? He is a strong regional player in the Black Sea region. He is demonstrating his, flashing his muscles, in the Middle East, in South Caucasus, in the Black Sea region. He is an important partner, but there are different views. They have different views, the two presidents, on the democratic values. What would be your recommendation to President Biden, how to deal with President Erdogan?
I'll start off on that just briefly. I think it's a good thing that Biden is having a bilateral meeting with Erdogan, particularly since there seemed to be very little interest in working on that relationship in the first weeks of the Biden administration. Turkey is very difficult. There are tremendous concerns about its backsliding on democracy, concerns about its playing games with Russia geopolitically. And of course, there's the S-400 issue. But I think it's worth the effort to try to coax Turkey into a more constructive posture vis-a-vis the United States and NATO. Try to work with the Turks in areas where they're actually working, at least in ways consistent with our interests, trying to promote a political settlement in Libya, for example, or finding ways to kind of amicably divide up all the new offshore energy resources being discovered in the Eastern Mediterranean. I think there's room for win-win outcomes there, and U.S. diplomacy could engineer that. So the S-400 is a very tough issue. Erdogan doesn't want to admit he made a mistake, but there may also be technical solutions to provide different systems and to put those into mothballs, at least if they won't give them back, at least put them in a warehouse where they can't do any harm to the F-35 program. But the short answer is Turkey is hard to live with sometimes, but they're in the most strategic position in the alliance. We need Turkey at least to be pulling in the same direction on most issues, and we should work to achieve that.
Related to Turkey, it touches upon Turkey, but if we're going to be discussing what the US can do for the larger region at risk, then some concrete proposals to further develop the 3Cs initiative, which was initially, which has been supported by the United States. But I think it can be kicked up even to a higher level with more US participation, because it is strategically a really good idea that touches upon everything from my country down to Georgia, and with Ukraine also there. And I think that it has a good deal of potential if it really gets the full weight of US support and participation behind it, and would certainly perhaps convince some of the recalcitrant members here. But I think it's one of the sort of good ideas to come out of the last 5-6 years. And I mean, I think despite Trump, it was one of the good ideas to come out in the last 5-6 years. And anything that where the US can sort of lean on countries and also put in more from its own side, I think would be highly welcome as one of the outcomes of this trip to Europe.
I agree with that, and I would just add 2 additional points. One, to work with Turkey on a broader Black Sea strategy, which is desperately needed and should fully integrate Ukraine and Georgia in an effort to deter and contain increasing Russian activity. And secondly, enlist Turkey to develop the kind of forward-looking enlargement strategy for Ukraine and Georgia that I was talking about in my opening remarks.
Mike?
I agree with my colleagues.
Okay. Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much for your very, very valuable comments and for your time. And I wish you all success, and I wish you all one day, better soon, coming to Georgia and having these discussions with not virtually, but in person. So wish you all success. Thank you very much for your participation, and hope to see you soon in Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can't wait. We
Thank
can't
you.
wait.
We can't wait. Great discussion. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.